back to Max Talk. What I'm going to talk about today is a soldier's eye for ground. So I'm going to have to explain myself and what exactly do I mean by that. This is something that it's a skill that needs to be developed. What it's about how you look at ground, or we could say terrain. How you look at the terrain, how you look at the ground, and the kind of assessments and judgments you make of that. So, typically people will, look outside at stuff and say, oh, that's pretty. Doesn't it look pretty? Well, a soldier doesn't see things like that. The soldier sees the ground, because the ground is absolutely essential. So what we might, to try and put this into perspective, is if we're conducting small unit tactics, then what we're concerned about is things such as spatial relationships, angles, and how the terrain fits. It's kind of that's kind of what it's about. You've got numbers, enemy, friendly forces, positioning, and then you've got how the terrain affects that, and you're trying to create angles. Such as, for example, I've talked many times about the 90-degree angle that you might want to use, for example, between a support by fire element and an assaulting element. That's sort of a 90-degree angle. 90-degree angle, support by fire and assault. So you've got that sort of angle, support by fire and assault, 90-degree angle. So a lot of it's spatial relationships. And so generally, if we want to think about direct fire weapons, so direct fire weapons are weapons that have a flat trajectory. Yes, there's ballistics, etc. But generally, a direct fire weapon is something that I fire. It goes from me through to the target and beyond. So it's got a flat trajectory, roughly. Indirect fire weapons have a sort of a high trajectory. So what they'll do is they'll go up and they'll come down. So we're talking about things such as mortars, etc. And so that's kind of how this plays in. The effect of small arms fire and the effect of weapon systems and how we relate that to the ground. So direct fire weapons generally are going to be obviously line of sight within range of the weapon. They go from the firer to the target, through and beyond if there's somewhere beyond to go. Indirect fire weapons can target people behind a piece of terrain, but clearly they're only going to properly be effective if they can be observed. So there's sort of observed and unobserved indirect fire, and really for it to be effective, indirect fire needs to have an observer who's effectively calling the shots and adjusting fire onto that position. So you might have a hill, and on one side you've got your, for example, mortars or artillery, and on the other side you've got the enemy position, and the mortars and artillery can physically fire over the hill, but it's only going to be effective if you have an observer who can actually see the fall of shot. And generally here, what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be concerned about direct fire weapons. So if we bring it back down to sort of an individual level, then I've talked before about use of cover and working your cover. And what I've talked about there, really we're talking about micro terrain and features such as, barricades, obstacles, trees. I've talked about stacking trees. I've written about it in the tactical manual. And this is very much sort of micro terrain individual stuff. And so what we tend to find is that it's a game of angles in many respects. So at an individual level, if you're, for example, conducting either CQB within a structure, or you're out in a location which has got trees, so you've got these kind of vertical, walls, doorways, trees, etc., then it's sort of a game of vertical angles around that vertical angle around the side of those structures. And then obviously you've got horizontal, which tends to be the curve of the ground, that kind of thing. It could be sort of features such as walls, etc. So you've got those horizontal angles where, and this is all how we try and sort of get shots onto the enemy whilst using cover. This is very much micro terrain, and this is not a soldier's eye for the ground, which is what I'm talking about today. That's working your cover. It's fire positions and working your cover. So for a soldier's eye for the ground, this is very much tied in with conducting a combat estimate, what we used to call an appreciation, and looking at the ground as part of, you're looking at terrain. I call it ground all the time. Terrain, because it's a British thing. So you've got ground, which terrain, slash enemy. So you're considering the ground in conjunction with the enemy. And this is in any situation where you've either come across, this is a hasty situation where you've come under enemy fire and you're deciding whether to assault or break contact, or you've actually planned something. You're planning an ambush, you're planning a raid. You've got to consider the terrain in conjunction with the enemy, and of course in conjunction with what assets you have in terms of friendly forces. So we've got to consider it. So what am I looking at when I look at the ground? Well, the clue that I gave you before was direct fire weapons. So we're concerned about observation and fire. Enemy observation as in lines of sight, and enemy fire as in lines of fire. So when you're looking at the ground, and you can do this in many ways, you can do it for a defensive situation, and it's a good way to sort of start to think about it. You can do it for an offensive situation, and you can do it for patrolling. So this also ties very much into route selection for when you're wanting to conduct a patrol. When you look at the ground, what you want to consider is, where is the enemy position? Where am I? And then what is the ground going to do to either help me or not help me? So what are the freedoms or what are the constraints that the ground is providing me in order to get done what I want to get done, which is get the mission done? And so the kind of thing you want to consider is covered approaches. So what's a covered approach? Covered or concealed. So a covered approach is something where you might be able to use a creek bed or a small draw to approach an enemy position without being observed and therefore without being in the line of direct fire. A concealed approach would be something more like a hedge line or tree line where you're not necessarily getting cover from fire, but you might be getting cover from view. One way to think about this is if you've got a house. Now, probably, in an urban environment, maybe a little bit more complicated, but obviously, urban environment is the same. It's the same idea. But if you had a rural house, imagine you were in a rural house and you went to your house and you decided, how am I going to defend this? And so, what you're conducting effectively is a defense appreciation. And what you want to look at is, from your house, what can you see in terms of the terrain, and therefore what is available for enemy approaches? Therefore, what do we have? So we have perhaps an open field, and we can see it going 400 yards, and down the bottom maybe there's a creek. So we can see that maybe the enemy could kind of push up in the creek, and maybe they could have a 4x5 position 400 yards away. Maybe it's downhill, maybe it's not ideal. And so maybe that's not a good approach for the enemy, but we need to consider it. But maybe on the left over there, maybe there is actually a wooded draw that approaches the house, and we can't actually see into that. So that is a perfect example of a soldier's eye for the ground, because that gives the enemy a covered approach. It also gives us a covered egress and a covered way to go out and patrol or perhaps even counterattack. And this is how these things need to be considered. So if you were doing a defense estimate in that sense, you could look at that draw, which gives you that approach, and you can consider how you might deny that to the enemy. When I talk about denial, different type of denial, you can deny a route by the use of obstacles, and that's somewhat easier when it comes to vehicles. But what you have to consider is any kind of barrier or defense you put in will not stand for a determined enemy, and it's not going to stand for an enemy who's on foot and who's determined. And at the same time, if you ever put an obstacle in place, you might put some wire in place, or fell some trees across a road, or whatever you're going to do. If you put an obstacle in place, it must be covered by view and fire. So what that starts to make you think is, well, we've got this draw, there's a trail up the draw, maybe I can deny that, make it a little bit harder, put some wire across it, but how am I actually going to observe that? Because if I can't observe it, then it's a route for an enemy approach. And therefore, can I put a camera on it? Do I need to put an observation post on it? The kind of thing that they would do in the military was, if it's sort of an infantry unit, if there's ground that they were not able to cover properly when they set up the defensive position, they may even send out an observation post or a standing patrol to cover that piece of ground that can't be observed. So generally what we talk about is we can talk about defilade, and the general term that I grew up using was dead ground. So dead ground is ground that, defilade is something where if I'm behind it, I'm behind a wall, I'm in defilade to you. Dead ground on a more of a macro scale is if I'm looking out across the terrain and then the terrain drops off into a draw or a valley even, and I can't see into that valley, then that is all dead ground to me. So unless I've got observation on that, then that's an enemy approach, a potential enemy approach. So we're looking at dead ground. We also use dead ground when we're wanting to patrol and we're mitigating our risk of compromise, and also when we want to approach an enemy position, you're going to want to look at the dead ground, which is the same as a covered approach, and you're going to want to use that and move up. And so if you're planning some kind of assault, then you're going to look at where can I put my support by fire, where can I have a sort of a 90-degree angle, and how am I going to sort of tie those two in together, getting up to my position where I can assault from, whether it be a hasty situation or whether it be a planned raid. So you're going to want to use the covered approaches. And you'll notice that, so I use the example of your house, but of course, I mean, you could even do this when you're driving along and you can look out and you can see, areas of interesting ground. And when I see ground, I actually find it interesting to see, the curve and the shape of the ground and how that could be used or how that could not be used. And so you could even see, houses as you're driving along, and you think, well, if I was defending that, what would the covered approaches be to that? What are the potential avenues of approach? And you can see what the dead ground is and what the dead ground isn't. The ultimate point is that if you get caught as an infantryman in the open ground, that's where you're going to be killed. And so you've got to have an eye for the ground. You've got to train it. You've got to practice it. One way to do this is by what we call TEWT, which is T-E-W-T. And I got a couple of them. I got some planning exercises actually in the back of the tactical manual, which they give you a location on a map and you have to plan. And you can use Google Earth and you can kind of like run the ground on Google Earth and you can plan things given a scenario. And so a TEWT, tactical exercise without troops, is a good way of getting an eye for this. So what you do is it's always good to have someone else set it up for you. And so you would go out onto a piece of ground and it could be a defense TEWT or an attack TEWT, and they'll sit you there and you don't get to walk around because you have to kind of make the decision that you were going to make. And so they'll say, this is where you are, that's where the enemy position is, this is what it constitutes, this is the situation, you've come under fire here, etc., etc. Now what are you going to do? And the idea is you don't have to make that snap decision. The idea is to do it in slow time, so you'd actually conduct a combat estimate. You'd sit there, you'd look at it, and you'd say, well, okay, what have I got on the left? What have I got in the center? What have I got on the right? And this is a great way of trying to figure out, by observation, what the dead ground and what the covered approaches are. And then once you've completed that, once you've come up with a plan, you can then go walk these various pieces of ground, walk that covered approach and see if it really was a covered approach. Have an observer up there and, try and move around it and see whether it does actually work for you. And this is how you're going to develop that soldier's eye for the ground. This is absolutely essential. I've talked before about, if you're going to be tactically proficient, you have to be playing chess, not checkers. So many people out there are playing checkers. Even the guys that concentrate on things like CQB, because CQB is all the rage. And CQB is really important, but it's just a facet. It's just a facet of the whole bigger picture. For example, in the real world, if you were to do a CQB assault, as in you were to assault a building, you have to get to it first. And so getting to that building is the small unit tactics piece. Getting to that building is a squad attack. Once you approach, breach, and enter that building, yes, you're going into CQB, but you still can't forget the bigger picture. You can't only think about room entry and clearance. You've got to think about the bigger small unit tactics picture how it all ties in. You're not just going to arrive at a front door and then just go through the front door. You've got to get to the front door. Preferably you won't go through the front door anyway. So hopefully that serves as a kind of an introduction to A Soldier's Eye for the Ground. I can't do anything practically in this venue, this format, but it is the kind of thing, for example, when we run the Combat Leader course, which is coming up in October, then you will actually plan real missions and conduct them with UTM man marker rounds against a live OPFOR, and you have to decide on things like, where am I going to put my support by fire? What's my covered approach? And if you don't get it right, there are UTM rounds coming in and you will take simulated casualties. Thanks very much. And I always forget, I'm trying my best, I always forget, but please like, share and subscribe to the Max Velocity Tactical YouTube channel. It does help, so I'm trying to get the word out here. Chess, not checkers. This is the real deal here. We're talking real small unit tactics. We're not talking pew-pew. We're talking the real deal. This is part of the whole warrior. It's extremely important. You need to get on top of this. You need to learn it. You need to understand it. Thanks very much.